one teaching assistant in particular. She was his TA for about 3 or 4 years, and she's now gone on to train to be a teacher. She changed his life. She said she's learned so much from working with him. They've got 3 kids in one of the classes she's teaching who have got ADHD, and she's like, I know the strategies, I know what to do. And she just said to my son, we learned so much from working together, because she was learning as much as he was at the time. So I'm really lucky. I think one person can completely change your child's journey.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews alongside parents sharing their real life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking to parent guest Kate Peers. Kate is the mum of 3 boys and owner of Department Store for the Mind, an online shop that allows you to explore the world inside your head, offering products such as stickers, homeware, gifts, stationery and prints that enable a deeper human connection and inspire simple actions so that you may be content with yourself and live well. Kate is also a youth mental health First Aid England trainer. Welcome aboard, Kate.
Thank you.
I have so much to thank you for, and I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you today, because this is actually quite a momentous moment for me, because it's the first time we've ever spoken in person. So for everyone listening, I first met you about 6 years ago when I reached out via a DM after reading a blog that you wrote for Molly Gunn, aka Selfish Mother, at a time when I was feeling unbelievably alone. And I actually talk about this and you, if you haven't listened in the opening episode of this podcast. So for anyone who's interested in hearing more, then check that out. But my son had been diagnosed with ADHD about a year or so beforehand, and your blog post was the very first time I felt kind of seen or understood. And actually, in many ways, you and that conversation are what inspired me on a journey that I guess today's become a real vocation with me. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to begin by reading that DM just to anyone listening to help them know that they are not alone in those feelings, even if it seems that way.
Yep, fine with me. That's lovely.
Thank you, Kate. So it said, hello, I've just read your notes on a naughty boy post for Selfish Mother, and I wanted to tell you I totally get it, because this is me, minus the same classroom issues. I understand exactly how you feel and how relentless it is with no end in sight. My son is almost 8 now, and underneath the volume of activity and emotion is a kind, sensitive, loving, creative and funny little boy. He was diagnosed with ADHD just over a year ago, a label that I've tried not to make a big deal of so as not to make him different. But I've been wondering lately if that's where I'm going wrong. Perhaps I should be more honest and open about the label, as you say, to help adults accept his differences and to help alleviate the worry I carry for him. Like you, I cry often because I want to protect him. Above all else, I want him to be happy. I wish I had a crystal ball just to give me a glimpse of later life so I know he'll be okay. Thanks for your honesty and making me feel a little less alone. Claire.
Oh, a bit weepy listening to that.
It's quite emotional, isn't it? I don't know how you feel, because it's quite a long time ago.
Yeah, and also the fact that you mentioned the crystal ball, and now we've got the crystal ball. So that's really interesting, because, thinking about where I was then versus now, it's just so different.
That's it, exactly. And it was the crystal ball word that jumped out for me, because, that it's a big chunk of time since I first sent that message to you. And I do have that crystal ball in terms of where I am now, and I couldn't have possibly imagined it. But also, I guess in many ways, this podcast becomes like a crystal ball for people listening. So thank you, Kay. I mean that really sincerely. This is a genuinely very special moment for me. So on that, can you begin by briefly introducing yourself and telling us about your neurodivergent children?
So I'm a mum to 3 boys who are now 10, 13 and 14. My middle one, who I wrote the naughty boy post about, he's not a naughty boy, but was very much labelled one when he was little by certain parents or teachers. He was diagnosed with ADHD and ASD. I think in the end, about 6 or 7 privately. And it took us until he was about 10 with the NHS. By the time we reached the end of the wait list, which was about 5 years, we got the diagnosis for him. In the meantime, my eldest son, we'd also realised, had a very different type of ADHD, more of a attention in the classroom. And he has also had a diagnosis, again, privately, and then eventually through CAMS.
I should say I completely agree with you that about the word naughty. He's absolutely not a naughty boy, and it's a word that I find actually quite triggering, but it's almost why it's so important to actually have these conversations to help people understand that kids are communicating something when they're struggling in that way. So what were those early signs or behaviours that made you suspect that obviously it began with your middle son, that he
Yeah.
might have ADHD?
I think it was around probably when he was about 3. And I remember talking to the health visitor who came around, and I said, there's just, he's got a lot of energy. And she said, oh, well, he's a 3-year-old boy, this is really normal. But I had my eldest son, who by this stage was about 4.5, 5. Again, he had quite a lot of energy, but compared to the middle one, he was like Roadrunner. I don't know if you know the
Yeah.
cartoon character, but you'd sort of go into a room and he'd jump on the sofa, jump off the sofa, run around the room, and out the door. And I just knew it was slightly different. We'd go to groups and activities, and he wouldn't be able to queue. He'd find that really stressful. And it was even then in some of those groups, they'd say, oh, well, he can't stay if he can't queue up. And I'd say to them, well, a few times I left, and then I started to find my voice, and I was saying, well, he's 3 years old.
Yeah.
3.5, what are we expecting of them at this stage? To stand in a line and wait, often with sort of 10, 11 people in a gymnastics club or something. But I also recognised at that stage how these places weren't inclusive. And if your child didn't conform, you'd often be asked to leave if they couldn't queue up, or if they had to, they just struggled to wait their turn. And they were the sort of first signs for me, really.
And when you then started to think, actually, maybe there is something else going on here, because actually I'm a bit like you, to begin with, to a degree, it's age appropriate, but it's almost as though underneath, and I had no older child to compare to, you do have a sense of, I feel like there's something else going on here, even though you may have absolutely no idea what that else actually is. But obviously, you then put forward, as you were saying, for a diagnosis. And when you then got that diagnosis, what were your initial thoughts and feelings?
I think for me, it was validation. I mean, a lot of people talk about it, the relief that by the time you often reach the diagnosis, you've gone through various processes. I had a parenting course where a lady came around every week and would try and tell me different ways to use strategies with him. And I tried them, tried the majority of them. But I thought, well, I'll do it. And you had to do it as a tick box exercise. And by the end, she said, oh, nothing's changed. And I said, well, I know, because, I feel like he's neurodiverse. So I don't think these strategies are going to work for him, these typical strategies. So it was a relief, because a lot of my parenting, I felt, had been challenged, and you start doubting yourself as a mum. Am I doing something wrong? Is this my fault? Am I not punishing him enough? And actually, that makes kids worse a lot of the time. And then, certainly through early schooling, there was quite a lot of that for him. And then it's years later, you have to unpick that damage to their self-esteem for feeling like they're constantly being sent out of the classroom or put in a corner, just because they're unable to cope in certain situations.
Yeah, rather than trying to figure out why. And it's interesting that you said then that you thought he was neurodiverse even at that point, because actually in my own experience, I knew there was something going on, but I actually genuinely just thought it was me. I thought it was me being this terrible mum, and other than perhaps having heard the term ADHD, I really knew nothing about it, and it certainly wasn't on my radar. So what did that feel like, to have a sense of really understanding what might have been going on beneath the surface and then getting that validation?
And I think I didn't really realise what ADHD was. And it's, that's clear by the fact that I completely missed it with my eldest, because it was presented in a very different way. And the more I've learnt about it over the years, the more I've seen it presents differently for everybody. And in fact, I got an ADHD diagnosis, it was during lockdown, when I was finishing off the forms for one of the boys. And I just thought, well, I'm ticking so many boxes here. And the lady who gave me my diagnosis said, particularly in girls, you can mask for years and years, and it will often come to around the menopausal stage, which is where I'm at, and your hormones will change, and suddenly all the things you've managed to cope with and you've managed to mask for years, you can't anymore, because the menopause comes in, and which is challenging anyway. So yeah, and I present completely differently to the other two. So it's so interesting learning all the different challenges. It's not just about sitting still in the classroom or being able to sit on a chair. It's about all the different challenges you face. And if you can manage to learn the coping strategies, it can help hugely.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Because it's a really complex neurodiversity. And if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. I'm the same.
Yeah.
I, like you, had my diagnosis in lockdown as an adult. I think hormones, perimenopause definitely played a part, but also I think parenting in amongst that, because I guess unbeknownst to me, my whole life I'd been masking and putting coping strategies in place that suddenly, when I'm then having to manage somebody else with quite demanding, complex needs, that suddenly I wasn't able to access those anymore. And I think that then mixed in with hormone changes meant that suddenly this stuff came to the surface. It can be quite a tricky time, can't it, trying to manage both elements?
Yeah, I think as well as there's a bit of sadness that, I'm nearly 50, and I found a bit of sadness that I was getting a diagnosis in my mid 40s. And I keep reminding the kids, you're really lucky to have this diagnosis, because you're going to be able to learn strategies now that will help you for the rest of your life. And hopefully they'll be able to advocate for themselves in ways I wasn't able to recognize or voice. So many things I've sort of gone along with in my life just because I should, or I thought I should. And now I'm like, no, I don't like doing that. So I'm not going to go. I don't like really busy places because I get a bit stressed out. So that's fine. I'm not going to go unless I have to, or I'll make sure I arrive at a time that suits me rather than everyone else. So yeah, it's a bit of sadness as an adult. And I think a lot of parents, I know people are saying, why are so many people got ADHD now? But certainly an older generation, it would just be missed a lot of the time, unless you were someone who was disruptive or causing problems. And even then, it might not be a diagnosis of ADHD that was given. You would literally be the naughty child. Everyone remembers kids at school that were just naughty. And I look back and think, God, so many kids must have been undiagnosed and unsupported at that time.
It's so true. You said earlier on about then the impact on self-esteem and then that damage that does to life outcomes. And I'm like you, I think now, my son was diagnosed so young, he was 6.5, but I genuinely feel like it was the best thing that ever happened to him. And then my daughter was recently diagnosed just before she turned 9. And I feel like having that awareness and that understanding is a gift, because there's real power in learning to understand yourself. And actually, throughout doing my own training as a coach with ADCA, I feel like I've continued to learn so much about myself. And then when I'm sharing that knowledge and trying to help support both my children, I do add to it the fact that I've only just learned this about myself. So I think the fact that I can share this with you, and you've got all these years to really understand what that means for you and to take it on board and then to find your own voice, is just, it's just such an incredible gift in many ways. Something that started off as me trying to understand, I guess, a diagnosis and a label and what that meant, and all the worry that I mentioned in that DM that I first sent to you, actually has really flipped on its head, I think, to be a gift, like actually the best thing that's ever happened to both of my children. How have things changed for you since then? We talked about that word crystal ball and the learning journey you've gone on with yourself, and obviously then with your older son.
I think I wish I'd had a crystal ball, because it would have saved huge amount of worry. But also for my middle son, the transition from primary to secondary didn't go so well. So I'm kind of glad I didn't know about that in advance. He ended up spending 6 months at home last year in year 7 while we looked for another school for him. But again, I feel very lucky that we found the right school for him for now. Many people, when they move from primary to secondary, it's such a huge transition. And if you've managed to get good support in place for the primary years, it can be really hard, that change. And the damage can be quite bad as well if you're going into the wrong setting or without the right support. So I'm grateful that he's back in school and going into school every day, thank goodness. But so from that point of view, I'm glad I didn't have a crystal ball. But equally, I remember coming home and writing the blog post about the naughty child when he was very young, and I was getting stares in the playground. And I just came home and I was in tears, just thinking, why are all these people staring? And no one offered to help. And probably some people wanted to, but didn't quite know how. And I was just a bit sick of it, really. And after I wrote it, quite a few parents at school read it. And I'm glad, because he started to get a few more invites to parties. People asked how they could help. I put it into the class group. And suddenly, I think people felt a bit ashamed of themselves because they had been judgy. And it was almost like, oh, if you go and hang around with that child who's climbing to the top of a classic one is he'd climb to the top of the climbing frame at school and then on the top of the climbing frame and jump off from there, which is obviously you're not supposed to do that. But does it matter? If your child's capable, it doesn't really matter. There's no ban on standing on the top of a climbing frame and jumping off. But I think parents thought, oh, well, if my child hangs around with him, they're going to suddenly be, getting into trouble. Again, you go back to that trouble, naughty label. And I think there was a lot more understanding after that. So that really helped. And he managed to get some fantastic support through primary. One teaching assistant in particular, Lucy, she was his TA for about 3 or 4 years. And she's now gone on to train to be a teacher. She changed his life. She said she's learned so much from working with him. And I saw her last week. She was saying that they've got 3 kids in one of the classes she's teaching who have got ADHD. And she's like, I know the strategies. I know what to do. And she just said to my son, we learned so much from working together, because she was learning as much as he was at the time. So I'm really lucky. I think one person can completely change your child's journey as well.
Oh, they really can. It's hard to put into words, I think, the impact that one person can make positively on a child like that. And I used to say to my son's previous school that actually, when I'm sharing information and resources, this isn't just for my son, this is for every child that you ever either goes through this school or that you ever go on to teach, because there are so many children you could argue that all children have got individual learning needs, right? But there are so many children that just need to be understood. And by being understood, we can make such a significant difference to them. Just by making very small tweaks and adjustments can be the difference between how they feel about themselves positively and then the things that they're able to achieve, versus getting stuck in a downward spiral because of negative labels, like you said, the word naughty. And so how has ADHD impacted your boy's education? You touched on it in terms of the fact that your son was out of school last year for 6 months, and changing that school environment, and also positively the benefit of having come across TAs and teachers that understand them. What accommodation and support have you found beneficial, or indeed what challenges have you had to deal with?
I think initially the old head teacher at the primary school, who's no longer there, she would argue to me, oh, well, if we make an exception for him, we have to make an exception for all, which is such an old-fashioned way of thinking about things, because you wouldn't be saying that to someone you can't. I always use something like asthma as an example. You wouldn't say, oh, you can't have your inhaler at school, or you can't have your crutches if you've broken your leg, or whatever it might be. And equally, if he needed to have certain adjustments, why couldn't he have them? It took me going to the governors because they started to exclude him from class when, instead of supporting him, they'd say, right, you have to go and sit in the corridor. And I really wasn't happy about that. And then there weren't enough staff to sit with him in the corridor. So they'd say, well, you need to pick him up. And I said, I can't do that. I've got a job. I can't come pick him up because you can't manage him. So I went to the governors, and that's when the one-to-one support was in place. And that was prior to having an EHCP. So I was incredibly lucky to get that. We then, when we were under CAMS, we started medication, which was a really tricky decision, something that Cody's dad and I disagreed on at the time for quite some time because of the preconceptions we had about it. But both of us were talking about it the other day because there's a CAMS review coming up, just saying it was the best decision for our son. It took a while to find the right one, but it's definitely supported him in class with being able to focus. And I remember telling his teacher at the time that we were considering medication. And he said to me, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. He'll turn into a zombie. And I've seen a child medicated before and he'll change. He's not changed at all. He's exactly the same person. He's got exactly the same energy. He can just focus a bit more in class, which has been completely game-changing for him. And I remember talking to his teacher during SATs or around that time in year 6. And she said, oh, someone came in the other day and was watching him and said, oh, you'd never know he was the same child from 3 or 4 years ago. He just can sit, he can focus, he can join in discussions, he can take turns, he can wait and listen. All things that, obviously this age is a factor as well. But for us, that was really positive. Being out of school for 6 months wasn't so positive. And that was an example of a school who would not make reasonable adjustments, despite having promised that they would. And in fact, I took them to town as well, picked apart their SEN policies, told them how they were failing. It was an independent fee-paying school with small classes, which we thought would be really good for him. And they just completely failed us. We got a refund for the fees. They've changed their SEN policy as well. So I hope, it was quite a thing having to go through making the complaint, but I thought I can't have anyone else go through this. So it was great that they've changed some of their policies as a result of their failings.
It's obviously very sad that he had to go through that experience. And in fact, those two stories really highlight, don't they, how much a difference this can make in a child's life. If you get the right combination of support, how a child can thrive in an environment versus how they can be failed. And it's really sad that your son had to go through that. And at the same time, it's so amazing that you had the passion and the care to have that fight on behalf of other children to make sure that going forward, even though it's not the right school for your son, that they're not failing other children in the same way, which is such a phenomenally kind thing to do. But I think it's funny, isn't it? It's a bit like me doing this podcast. It's amazing what drives you once you're on this journey yourself and you see how much this matters and what a difference it makes, how it does become a vocation in itself, like your life work, not just to change things for your child, but to help pave the way for others.
Yeah, I think, I've got more confident as the years have gone on, as I'm sure you have as well, for advocating for my child, but then saying to other adults, this isn't good enough. Before, they would frame things often in a way to me that would shame me or make me feel like this is my fault or his fault. And, unfortunately, you do become quite sort of cross, I think, because you have to. But yeah, I'm just trying to make sure it's done in a positive way, not an angry way, which, I see a lot of people who understandably get really angry with the system. And I do feel I've been lucky, but also I've taken the time and had the time, I'm fortunate, to go through, pick these things apart, educate myself, and then fight the fight really in certain situations.
It is the educating yourself bit that resonates really deeply with me, because maybe that's the crystal ball. It's not that, like you said at the beginning about the emotions or that side of things. It's just understanding in many ways the journey you'll go on yourself through this, and how there is no fast track to it. Unfortunately, we have to go through it. We have to ride those emotions and we have to have those experiences. But actually, the other side of that, once you've learned so much more about, I guess, ADHD, not just as a whole, but then how it shows up in your child and their individual needs and how you can help advocate for them. It's the outcome and the successes we can achieve as a result of that. So I wondered whether there was a success story or a memorable moment or unique strength that's made you proud as a parent of your neurodivergent boys that you could share with us today.
I think for my middle son, it was probably when he reached year 6 and he was given they have a mentor when you join in reception and they're 4 or 5, a year 6 child's there to look after you. And he was given this lovely little boy called Arnie. And the friendship they developed was, they were just in love. It was like brothers. And I remember going to watch one of the assemblies on a Friday and seeing them sitting next to each other. And he took his role as a mentor so seriously, and just, he wouldn't let any harm come to little Arnie. And their friendship was just adorable. I think just seeing how far he had come and watching little kids at that stage who were in reception who couldn't sit still and were fidgeting, which most of them can't at the age of 4, but thinking, wow, there he is, the eldest in the school, able to, have someone look up to him. I just thought, well, I wish I could have seen that when he was 4 and I was freaking out and people were asking me why he couldn't sit down for story time. Just, it doesn't matter. I think that's a real motto of mine. Does it matter? A lot of the time now, I just think, no, it's not important. If he can't sit down for a meal for long, so what? As long as he eats a good meal, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter is such a great phrase to use, isn't it? Because you're right, most of the time it really doesn't. And I think hearing that is really beautiful, because actually that's him using his strengths, right? That's him being celebrated for who he is and actually allowing all those amazing qualities that so often get forgotten about just simply because they struggle to sit still or to concentrate, and actually the beauty and the growth that can come out of that when they're given that chance. My son had a really similar thing whereby, I think it was around the same age, he was given the opportunity to be a sports leader with boys in the year below. And the difference in him through doing that was huge, because it just meant that he was being himself, his absolute best self, and seeing the joy that was pouring out of him from doing that, and the way that he was seeing himself as a result of it was just quite a profound moment. So yeah, it's like you said, seeing those things, looking forward, and knowing that there are really positive things that come with all of this when you're worrying about all the really tough stuff, all the really emotional stuff when they're young and you're at the beginning of this. So with that crystal ball in mind, what one piece of advice would you like to leave parents listening to help them feel less alone on that journey?
I think connect with other people, like we connected on Instagram, and that's one of the most positive things about something like Instagram. And some of the Facebook groups are better than others. Sometimes you can feel a bit down when you're in a Facebook group because you're hearing a lot of the challenges, but there's pros and cons with that. I think it depends on where you're at on your journey, but you can dip in and out and mute them if it's too much. But yeah, connecting with other people and looking at people who are ahead of you. So for me, that's been just such a lifesaver. There's someone called Only Girl in the House, Jess, and I followed her journey with her boys, and she lives quite locally as well, so I have met her. She's absolutely lovely, but just seeing how things can change and watching her go through challenges with teens and hormones and then coming out the other side, that just gives you hope. So, it doesn't stop things from going wrong, and it won't stop your own challenges, and they're all different, but it will be all right. And knowing that my son now at 13 can say, oh, no, I'm not going to that climbing wall because that one's too busy. I don't like it. It's packed. But I'll go to the other one. It's something as simple as that. He knows himself now. They can't do that when they're younger. So if I could give one bit of advice, it will get easier with age as well, when they start to know and are able to recognise their own their own challenges and what they can cope with, that's helped massively.
That's so hopeful. You use that word, but it is hopeful. And you're right, it absolutely does change with age. And I think connection is everything. And I can't emphasize enough, like you were a complete stranger. And in an absolute moment of desperation, I sent you a message and you were so kind to respond to me. And that truly changed everything. And you used the word a moment ago, lifesaver. And I mean it sincerely when I say that you were a lifesaver to me where I was at that point very early on in my journey. And I wouldn't be sitting here without that. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us today, Kate. And just thank you for being there. Just the very simple act that you probably didn't think anything of responding to that message had a absolutely life-changing, profound effect on both me and then my children as a result. So thank you.
Oh, it's lovely. I think what you're doing is absolutely brilliant as well. So well done. It's going to be helping so many people.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. If you'd like to find out more about Kate and visit her online department store for the mind, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.